Thanks very much, Tim. If we could move to the next slide, please, and the following one. So Tim mentioned that we're a stem cell and regenerative medicine company, and the concept of using cells as medicine has undergone an enormous amount of growth in the last 5 years. We've seen some real revolutions in the ability to harness the body's own processes of defense, repair, and regeneration. And that is the cornerstone of cell-based therapies, cell medicines or regenerative medicine. And Cynata's at the very forefront of those technologies with our mesenchymal stem cell, or MSC, therapeutic product platform. We have a unique manufacturing approach which allows us to manufacture these very challenging products for production by deriving the starting material from a single donor and a single donation. We have accumulated strong safety and efficacy data and had a landmark phase 1 clinical study in GVHD complete a year or two ago with very, very compelling results. Multiple clinical trials underway and a further that's expected to get underway later this year, a large addressable market. The concept of using cells as medicine really targets those areas of human disease that represent the major challenges, chronic diseases, particularly those associated with aging, like osteoarthritis, heart disease, and stroke, which to a large extent are undruggable using current medicines. And finally, significant value upside. As the company progresses its portfolio, we see great growth opportunities. Next slide, please. A quick summary of our platform technology, which we call Cymerus. And again, this is a process for manufacturing MSC-based therapeutic products. The challenge that we face with cell-based medicines is unique to that particular category. The manufacture of conventional drugs is basically synthetic chemistry, whereas producing a living drug like a cell is much more complex. So the challenges associated with manufacture often represent the major commercialization hurdle. Cynata's technology addresses that, at least as far as MSCs are concerned, in a process that's patented by our company. We recently had some great news around our patent portfolio, and which utilizes a technology called induced pluripotent stem cells, which resulted in a Nobel Prize in 2012. iPSCs allow us to have a starting material that is independent of a requirement for continually resourcing material from donors. The key advantages there is that it allows us to have a very versatile product portfolio, a scalable manufacturing technology, cost efficiency, and finally, product consistency. One thing we've heard a lot about in the last 6 to 12 months has been product consistency, and that's arisen from the FDA's assessment of a stem cell-based therapeutic product in this category, which was disappointingly not approved. Not our product, another product. But one of the key concerns of the regulator, the FDA, was product consistency. And this is always a requirement for the development of any therapeutic product. Safety, efficacy, and finally, consistency in manufacture. And Cynata's technology addresses that concern with a highly consistent approach to manufacturing MSC-based therapeutic products. Next slide, please. This sums up the difference or point of difference between the conventional approach to manufacturing MSC-based therapeutics. And bear in mind that MSCs are now a proven therapeutic modality. We have MSC-based therapeutic products on the market in countries like Japan and in Europe. The FDA in the US remains a challenge for the industry, but in confirming the utility of MSCs, we already see those products on the market. But they're derived by a traditional approach, which relies on lots and lots of donors from whom the cells are extracted and purified, leading to the finished product. Our approach in the lower panel here on this slide shows that once we've obtained a single donation from a single donor, we can generate the starting material that allows our production process to continue independently of going back to donors. So it ensures that we have a highly consistent product, because in the conventional approach, of course, a reliance on multiple donors doesn't recognize the fact that every donor is different, and therefore the cells derived from each donor are also different. On the other hand, Cynata's technology assures a highly consistent and efficient and very potent finished product. Next slide, please. Where we've headed with this technology base now is well and truly into the clinic. And as some of our earlier speakers have mentioned, valuation is driven by clinical data. It's all well and good to have a hot technology that looks like it treats conditions in animal models, but ultimately value is generated from clinical trials. We now have a product in a phase 3 clinical trial in osteoarthritis, trial underway here in Australia in respiratory distress, initially targeting only COVID-19 patients, but that's been broadened to include patients with respiratory distress from any cause. A trial that we hope to get underway with our partner Fujifilm in graft versus host disease, a trial that's currently on hold in critical limb ischemia, on hold because of the pandemic, and a trial in diabetic foot ulcers that will get underway later this year. 2 additional potential clinical studies in IPF and renal transplant are in investigatory phase at the moment. Moving to the next slide, please. To now walk you briefly through our clinical portfolio, the osteoarthritis phase 3 trial is now well underway. It commenced patient recruitment last year. It's being conducted at sites in New South Wales and Tasmania. Represents a huge commercial opportunity. There is currently no cure for osteoarthritis. It is a progressive degenerative disease that ultimately gets worse and worse. And yes, it can be masked by analgesics, as simple as aspirin, all the way through ultimately to opioids. And then eventually surgery, a replacement of the arthritic hip or the knee or both. But there's no cure. And the potential here for our technology is to alter the outcome of this disease. In other words, to give a patient 10 more good years out of their joint before ultimately they go on to a surgery. That trial we expect to report in 2024. It's one of the largest such trials ever conducted with MSCs, 440 patients. So it's extremely well powered to demonstrate whether the product is effective or not. Next slide, please. Our MEND trial is a phase 1/2 trial in respiratory distress. Respiratory distress is basically the complication that occurs in respiratory diseases, including COVID-19. And we've all heard about the challenge that these patients have that ultimately go on to much more serious complications of their infection. They can no longer breathe. It's a major medical challenge. There's very little that can be done for these patients when they get to an ICU other than to ventilate them and to try and manage their symptoms. What we know with MSCs being the coordinator, if you like, of the immune response is that it has the ability to damp down or to modulate that excessive inflammatory response in these patients that leads to respiratory distress. That trial commenced last year. We commenced patient treatment early this year, and it's now well underway. Of course, with the current explosion in patient numbers in New South Wales and possibly also here in Victoria, we certainly have a larger pool of patients that should allow us, based on our current expectations, to complete this trial this year. Next slide, please. We expect to get another trial underway later this year in diabetic foot ulcer. These are the chronic wounds that occur particularly on the feet and lower limbs of patients with type 2 and type 1 diabetes. And it is a growing problem for which treatment really hasn't changed in the last 100 years. It's still treated by dressing, surgical dressings. Our approach to this challenging condition is to treat the patients with a cell therapy that will ultimately accelerate recovery of that wound and potentially get the patient mobile again, and obviously out of the high cost of care and management. That trial, as I said, will get underway, we hope, later this year. We have received ethics committee approval to get the trial underway, and we're now just going through the final logistic activities to initiate patient recruitment. Next slide, please. The value of the market opportunities I've already touched on. Osteoarthritis is a huge global problem. 3 million patients here in Australia, for example, and the commercial opportunity is in excess of $11 billion per year. The other facts and figures that you can take there on that slide, and please do refer to this after the presentation. Next slide, please. We have a rich portfolio, as I mentioned before, in the clinic. In osteoarthritis, we hope soon in graft versus host disease, MEN trial underway, and a diabetic foot ulcer trial soon to get underway. But besides that, the company has a rich data set in preclinical studies. These are animal models of the diseases that you see there: coronary artery disease and heart attack, for example, pulmonary disease, and other areas as well that represent targets for our partnering activities as well as potential future therapeutic candidates for clinical trial. Next slide, please. We see three major pillars to drive shareholder value. The first, as we've discussed, is to generate robust clinical data to show that our products are safe and effective and that will result in a better treatment outcome for patients with the study conditions. We also have a vigorous partnering strategy where we seek to engage with potential partners, that is big pharma or big biotech companies that have the resources and capability to take our products to the global stage. And then finally, also strategic exits such as through an M&A. And Cynata was the subject of several takeover bids back in 2019, one of which was announced to market at $2 per share. Next slide, please. We see, of course, comparables across a number of ASX and other listed companies, and it's always challenging to compare apples to apples. But if you look at some of the other companies in our space that are in phase 3 clinical development, as is Cynata, there's significant value upside potential there for the company. Next slide, please. Finally, what investors can look for in the next 6 to 12 months is the completion of our startup activities and the commencement of recruitment in our diabetic foot ulcer trial, the completion of recruitment in the MEND clinical study in respiratory distress, longer term, the completion of recruitment in our phase 3 osteoarthritis trial, finalising clinical trial plans for potential new candidates such as IPF and renal transplantation, advancing our US regulatory strategy, and bearing in mind the US, of course, is the largest market for pharmaceutical products worldwide. So opening the door to the US market through the FDA is, of course, a huge value driver for pharma companies and biotech companies. So we hope to make good progress on our regulatory strategy this year. And then finally, progress on our commercial discussions and the execution of further corporate partnerships. Thank you very much for your attention today, and I look forward to Tim's questions if we have time.
We do have time. Thank you, Ross. Just some more details, please, if you don't mind, on your COVID trials. People are asking questions around when they will conclude, how many are in that trial, and then ideally, what are you hoping the stem cells will do for those patients with respiratory disease syndrome?
Well, as I mentioned, Tim, the trial is underway. We are recruiting patients and treating them. We're well into the trial, and it's a little difficult to predict exactly when the trial will wrap up. I mean, no one would have predicted the situation at the moment in Sydney with more than 100 patients in ICUs. That's evolved very, very dramatically over the past 6 weeks or so. Likewise, in Melbourne, case numbers are going up. So it's hard to predict exactly when we'll complete recruitment in that trial, but suffice to say, of course, with growing patient numbers, that does tend to accelerate our completion of the trial. What we hope to achieve, of course, this is an early clinical study, and we're trying to better understand how our product, our MSCs, might be useful in these patients. We do know from other clinical studies that have been conducted around the world that MSCs appear to damp down that excessive inflammatory reaction that occurs as a consequence of the invasion by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And ironically, it's not the virus per se that's causing the problems in these patients, but it's rather their immune reaction to it, an overreaction, if you like, an excessive inflammatory response, which is causing the problems. And we know that MSCs singularly have an enormous capability of modulating that response. So ideally, what we want to see is to get a signal from the data that we'll analyse that will allow us to better design a follow-on clinical study with clear endpoints around efficacy.
And just by way of history, for those people or investors that don't understand the history of your COVID trials and how that came about, was that a result of the company pivoting quickly, or were you already trialling in this respiratory disease area?
Well, respiratory distress is a major problem long before COVID came along. As I mentioned, it arises in patients who have got respiratory infections from any cause. And influenza obviously is a huge cause of that. So we were already looking at and had completed early last year a trial in acute respiratory distress syndrome in an animal model, a large animal model in sheep. And the data from that was extremely positive, and it hit just at the time that the COVID pandemic was taking off. So we thought, wow, this is a great opportunity for us, the company and our shareholders, to quickly, I hate the term, but I'll use it, to quickly pivot into a COVID-19 trial. As that trial just got going, of course, we were out of the first wave largely in Australia at the time, and so patient numbers declined, and we expanded the trial recruitment to include patients with respiratory distress from any cause. But of course, now it's done full circle again, and we've got a lot more COVID patients than we would have expected 6 months ago.
And just quickly on the other applications we're talking about here, in terms of diabetic foot ulcers, what would an ideal outcome be, given these ulcers are really hard to treat?
Well, these are not only hard to treat, but they're chronic. And the problem with these conditions is that the chronicity. In other words, they require ongoing high-cost care. What we hope with our product is that ultimately the wound will heal, and that perhaps, yes, the patient may end up with another wound if their diabetes doesn't improve, but at least they're out of that continuous cycle of requiring district nurses or going into clinics to have their wounds dressed, and they're just not healing. So we want we want our product to show that the wound can be healed very, very effectively.
And with osteoarthritis, you're in the phase 3 trial. Will the results of this trial be enough for you to get regulatory approval of the product in places like the US and EU?
Well, that's the subject of a conversation that we've yet to have with the FDA. We will have that conversation with them at the appropriate time. But as I think many of your more savvy listeners or viewers will know, typically a approval is after 2 well-controlled, well-designed phase 3 clinical studies. This is one of those. It is possible that if the data is convincing enough that regulatory agencies may say 1 trial is sufficient, but that, I hasten to add, is a conversation we've got yet to have.
Understood. And finally, you just appointed a chief medical officer. What are you expecting somebody in that type of role will bring to the table?
Well, their experience in interacting with regulatory agencies, that there are no hard and fast rules with regulators. You go to them with a proposal, explain the rationale and the basis for the design of the clinical study or the endpoints, and then it's okay, kind of an interaction, and experience with that interaction is vital. We have some of that on our board already with Dr. Darryl Maher, who's ex-CSL and obviously has enormous experience in biological product development and experience with regulatory agencies, but in-house expertise in that is going to be the focus of our Chief Medical Officer's responsibilities.